Go ahead.
Thanks, Ricardo. Mandy Archibald is an artist and nurse academic with a PhD from the Faculty of Nursing, University of Alberta. She is currently a CIHR Fellow and NHMRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Adelaide, Australia, co-leading the knowledge translation arm of a transdisciplinary Centre for Research Excellence in Frailty and Health Aging with Professor Alison Kitson. In her PhD, Mandy merged the arts and sciences to develop digital, patient-driven arts and research-based educational materials for parents of children with asthma under the support of a Canadian Child Health Clinician Scientist Award. Her postdoctoral research extends this work as she continues merging the arts and research to enhance humanistic and person-centered research and care for vulnerable populations. As a multidisciplinary artist, Mandy has exhibited work for 19 years in Canada and abroad, and has commissioned and completed 55 artistic works in circulation. Mandy has received numerous awards for her research, which has been published in leading journals such as the Journal of Advanced Nursing, the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, and Implementation Science. As an active arts and research practitioner, Mandy is an advocate for integrating the arts and sciences and foresees such artistry and innovation as increasingly integral to the health and research enterprises. Mandy, we're very happy to have you here with us today. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will now make you the presenter so that you can show your computer screen.
Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks, Yvette, for the lovely introduction.
Go ahead now.
Here we are. Well, thank you both, and hello, everyone. It's a real privilege and a pleasure for me to be here to present this interactive session on the arts and qualitative research today. So I'm coming to you today as both a practicing artist and a researcher, and I'm really hoping that through this webinar I can share something for everyone. So regardless of your qualitative approach that you might be using, no matter what your disciplinary orientation, regardless of whether you've engaged extensively with the arts and research or not really at all, if it's just an interest for you, and no matter if you are a seasoned professor or early career researcher, I hope that the webinar will provide you with a sense of some current uses and potentials of the arts and qualitative research and how we might learn from artistic practice to better inform our research practices. So I confess that I do have a sort of evangelical belief in the power and potentials for arts and research. So I hope that I can share some of these unique contributions so that we can all look forward to conducting more meaningful and impactful research and artistic practices, which I believe this is a goal that ultimately we all have. So if you have questions that you don't get a chance to ask during the session today, please do feel free to send me an email afterwards, mandy.archibald@adelaide.edu.au, or I'm also active on Twitter. So there's my Twitter handle at Mandy_Archibald, and there's also a IIQM webinar hashtag that you can use, and I promise to respond. So American photographer and environmentalist Ansel Adams once said, "You don't take a photograph, you make it." So this quote highlights how even the most representational forms of art are constructive practices. Now, similarly, research, and arguably more so qualitative research, is understood as a constructive practice. Not only is it regarded as not a value-free enterprise devoid of subjective influence, but the influence of researcher as instrument is considered a valuable and integral part of the process. So artistic and research practices then have at their core many synergies. Both rely upon creativity, rigor, technical skill, and interpretive rigor. Both draw from broad influences to create representations of our world and experiences that we regard as true. In research, we regard these as trustworthy or rigorous. With art, we might comment on their verisimilitude, mere beauty, or truthful value. So as qualitative research becomes increasingly integral to understanding human experiences, informing interventions, improving organizational systems such as health and educational systems, the use of arts and research will continue to blossom across disciplinary and geographic divides. So researchers and practitioners are increasingly then looking to the arts to promote well-being, gain understandings of, and communicate about complex phenomena by way of therapeutic approaches or as data collection, dissemination, and even analytic strategies. So we're now seeing journals dedicated specifically to arts and health, arts and science, numerous commissions across the world, and increasing acceptance of such methods as viable and even necessary to aid in communication and understanding. So the position taken today is very much that there are natural synergies between arts and qualitative research and untapped potentials for integrating arts and qualitative research. So we'll be covering some specific aims in today's session. We'll begin by discussing some key concepts, including guiding propositions, similarities and differences between arts and qualitative research. We'll examine 5 key lessons from the arts that qualitative researchers, and in fact, really researchers engaged in any type of research practice, can leverage for stronger research practice. And it's my thinking that by understanding such congruencies and differences between the methods and the practice of arts and qualitative research, we can explore how arts can uniquely inform qualitative research by drawing from various exemplars across health and social sciences, and this is mainly where my experience resides. Underpinning these aims is really a focus on a trifecta that I believe is, culminates in the contribution of arts towards qualitative research, and this includes communication, representation, and process. So these 3 components are critical to these intersections of arts and qualitative work, and we'll be returning to these at multiple times during the webinar today, so keep these at the foremost of your mind. We'll also be touching on various related yet distinct terms that are often understood differently depending on where you're positioned geographically and also in terms of your disciplinary training. So arts-based research at the top of this slide is where artistic practice is really central to inquiry. Each term is pertinent to the discussion, but arts-informed research might be the most relevant because it might be considered the most accessible way of integrating the arts and qualitative work. So arts-informed research is often considered in itself a mode and form of qualitative research that is influenced by, but not necessarily based in, the arts. So the methodology infuses language, process, and forms of literary, visual, and performing arts into scholarly inquiry for the purposes of advancing knowledge. And the main purposes of using this approach is to really understand some of the complexities of the human condition through alternative processes and representational forms of inquiry. And again, to reach multiple audiences by making scholarship more accessible, which is a constant struggle, I think, for anyone, regardless of whether you're engaged in qualitative mixed methods or quantitative inquiry. Similarly, arts-based inquiry is seen as a component of qualitative research, but it's often oriented towards action. So it has a type of social responsiveness, which in itself can be considered a component of rigor, particularly in the participatory action research domain. We won't be speaking specifically about our artography or arts-based educational research, but I do think it's useful to consider that these terms are very pertinent in the arts-based research domain, artography meaning more a method of inquiring into the world through an ongoing process of art making in really any art form and incorporating writing into that process. And we're all, of course, familiar with qualitative research, which I prefer to consider as an inductive and iterative process that results in the generation of narrative information, which we can then interpret and construct to comprise representations of subjects of inquiry that have some truth value. So key propositions guiding this work today are really quite broad and again apply very broadly to researchers from diverse traditions and practices. And the first is that we aim to conduct research that is meaningful and impactful and representational of the phenomena and individuals of interest to our study. So it's this truth value that represents much of the rigor of qualitative work. The second is that each research approach and artistic approach has a shortcoming. So differing types of research approaches provide unique ways of understanding and representing phenomena, that is, unique ways of knowing. So given this, we're encouraged to draw upon a range of approaches that help us achieve these understandings. So it's quite a pluralistic approach. The third is that arts are not an elitist niche. The arts can and should be available to everybody. I think arts too often are regarded as fine arts, so accessible only at settings affiliated with affluence, potentially associated with settings like museums or the opera. And in fact, adopting a position where arts and qualitative research can be mutually informative requires a much broader understanding of the arts as one that exists in the everyday. So this concept of art in the everyday, which is, an original concept by John Dewey in the 1930s, allows us to remove art from a privileged position, accessible only through formal means such as realist paintings and art galleries, into the realm of having an aesthetic experience. Now, this really means that, being moved by this spontaneous sight of something beautiful and eye-catching, like the look of shadows dancing on a street corner, is as valid an aesthetic experience as having an emotional response to a more formal artistic portrayal, like a Chopin nocturne, for instance. So turning attention now to the congruencies between qualitative research and the arts, which I propose that understanding such congruencies can help us better understand the nature of both qualitative research and how these areas can be mutually informative. So at their core, the arts and qualitative research do share many similarities, and the first relates to diversity and pluralism. So through both arts and qualitative research, we seek to understand and represent the human experience through diverse methodological approaches. So the research problem and associated research questions guides our selection of methods or approach in qualitative research, much as it does in the systematic practice of art inquiry. Methodological decisions are, or at least should be, directed by an understanding of what each method can offer in relation to understanding and representing and answering a question. So both art and qualitative research then embrace a pluralistic approach in ontology and epistemology. That is, both are predicated on an understanding that there's different ways of experiencing the world, different conceptions of reality that have both universal or shared and individual or private elements, and different ways of coming to know about these positions in reality. And so as such, both art and qualitative research are positioned in tension between the individual and shared experience. And one of my favorite authors, Elia Eisner, stated that artistically crafted work does create a paradox, revealing what is universal by examining in detail what is in particular. So he doesn't distinguish between arts-based research and artistically crafted qualitative inquiry, which again points to inherent similarities between these two approaches. So there are numerous congruencies between the practices of arts and qualitative inquiry, such as iterative hermeneutic approaches, the constructive and interpretive orientations, the uncertainty that one faces during the complex process of identifying and redefining problems, and throughout the complex process of analysis. Now, we'll be discussing lessons from the arts in relation to arts practice later on in this webinar. So as our experiences in the world are qualitative in nature fundamentally, and aesthetics and arts are a large component of day-to-day experience across cultures, these challenges of representation and communication that we face extend well beyond the research sphere and just reflect one of the most profound everyday experiences that we all face. How, for instance, do we represent our daily thoughts and emotions with those around us? How do we feel that we have adequate words at our disposal to accurately convey what we are thinking and feeling? All forms of communication and representation in varying extents are efforts at identifying and conveying what is core or foundational to a concept. So take, for instance, general representations of male and female gender. So one accessible way that these representations of gender are communicated across culture is through toilet signs. We've all seen them. So while male and female are English terms that may not be understood in different languages and geographic locations, the visual and symbolic representations of male and female gender are much more likely to be identifiable regardless of your position in the world, whether you're in Spain, China, Canada, Thailand, Oman. And here we see these visual representations from 9 diverse countries. So clearly, each varies in its level of complexity, and cultural differences are clearly visible. But each is recognizable and comprehensible regardless of cultural upbringing. So it's on this basis that we proceed, namely that the arts and qualitative research in differing extents enable us to access something both particular to, yet universal, about our understandings and experiences in the world. Moving then towards what qualitative researchers can learn from artistic practice. So recently a colleague and I, Dr. Clark, worked on a piece about this very topic for a number of months, drawing from our really diverse experiences. So mine is an artist and researcher interested in the intersections of arts and research and the impact and cultivation of creativity in pretty much every sphere of life. And Dr. Clark is a researcher in heart disease and scholar in effective academic practices, also interested in how to maximize creative scholarship. So we were also inspired by a book that I really found inspirational called Art and Fear. And it's one of the few books I've read that really gives a candid depiction of the fear and uncertainty that can be encountered in an artistic process. And drawing from this and a number of other materials and our experiences, we identified 5 lessons from the arts for better research. The first was to harness our values. And this really relates to the big why of doing research. So what keeps us up at night? What gets you out of bed in the morning? So where does your passion for problems come from? So understanding our relationships to research, why we do the qualitative research that matters, is really key to moving past a view of research as a series of tasks into a view of research as an expression of our own values. So this expression of values through practice is captured well in the artistic world. And one of my favorite examples is with artist Henry Matisse, who I've drawn a lot of inspiration from over the years, who really sought to find the essential character of things and express this through his work. So he used a variety of approaches to do this, but that core value persisted regardless of what he was doing. So tapping into our values as researchers and using these to guide practice rather than aiming to complete a series of tasks will provide a more rewarding and authentic research experience. So every artist needs a vision. And equally, every researcher should have a vision. So this challenge is for us to identify these visions and live it through our practice. The second lesson is really to never arrive. So there's an insatiable quest for knowledge and discovery that characterize most persistent and accomplished artists over time. Criticism and failure are interwoven into research experiences and are largely unpredictable, yet to accomplish our visions, we must proceed unabated and control how we respond to these setbacks. So most great artists are quite prolific artists. They get it wrong many, many times just so that they can get it right sometimes. And the same steadfast attitude in research, I think, is paramount to success and happiness. So our third key lesson from the arts for better research is to connect for creativity. Now, what this means is just to go wide, draw from diverse influences so we can approach old problems in new ways and identify new problems to approach as well. So David Bowie, I think, is a great example of an artist who drew from a wide range of influences to create unusual and highly creative work. It was always so fresh. Similarly, as researchers, we're continually challenged to create work that's innovative, yet that draws from previous work, while not being totally derivative. So much of the current logic in strategic research planning suggests that researchers should go deep. So select a topic, become an expert in that topic, and drill down, which definitely has a lot of merit. But the risk for this approach is really excessive narrowness. So a risk of overlooking pertinent research and influences from other sectors and fundamentally reinventing the wheel. So using the arts in qualitative research is no exemption to this rule. So in fact, the arts have in themselves been seen as research practice for many years. So in fact, Picasso was once quoted as saying, "I've never made a painting as a work of art, it's all research." So without this recognition, it's possible for qualitative researchers to claim innovation by appropriating arts-based approaches, when perhaps they should maybe be claiming more ignorance. So I think we do have to be cautious of that. Fourth key lesson from the arts for better research is to reconcile quantity and quality. And clearly, judging by this slide, more is not always better. Researchers are continually faced with pressures to produce more. So more publications, grants, outputs. So while sheer quantity of output should not be the primary driver for success in research, quantity in some respect is a driver for quality. So contrary to the all too common view of eureka as a light bulb or a apple falling on the head of Isaac Newton, for artists, the most creative work is often the result of regular working patterns. So similarly, waiting for the right moment to begin the creative task of writing your next qualitative research proposal or associated manuscript is unlikely to give you the results that you desire. So creativity is, ironically, often the result of a dedicated practice. And the fifth lesson is to balance fear and audacity, or in other words, be certain about uncertainty. So uncertainty is really central to the process of creation, whether we're creating a painting or in the trenches of a qualitative analysis. So regardless of the pursuit, there's a moment, and perhaps many moments, where doubt enters into the picture. And you question, will these findings ever fit together? How will I make sense of this particular case? How will I describe these findings in a way that isn't merely just a superficial skiff on the surface of their depth? Yet uncertainty and fear, if kept in check, keep us motivated against stagnation and keep us striving towards better and deeper understandings. Then quickly refreshing our minds then as we move forward into the how of some arts-based practices, recognizing that there's some overlap between some of these terms. We're really focusing on some, not so much on art practice, but art as research practice and arts and data collection, so arts for research, and also arts-based knowledge translation, which is fundamentally a way to use creative methods to communicate about our research for better understanding. So to understand how arts can contribute to qualitative research, two useful questions to ask might be, what can art do, and by what mechanisms? So we explore these questions in relation to art's contributions to nursing knowledge, given this is my disciplinary background. However, the areas of contribution, I think, extend well beyond nursing. So two dominant avenues by which arts-based approaches can contribute to knowledge is about knowing about phenomena, participants, yourself, or your context, and knowing through the arts, which also is quite different in that it suggests a type of embodied knowledge. So both of these avenues of knowing are predicated on an understanding that art is both a natural and ancient way of knowing both the world and our place in it, and on an understanding that we don't acquire knowledge by apprehending singular components of the world that we view in isolation, but rather we link these understandings through very complex processes of linkages and abstractions through concepts. And it's through these conceptual processes that we create connections to previously held knowledge and assign meanings to the artifact of our culture. So we're investigating which of these meanings are shared and which are specific to the individual, and it enables us to gain understanding and knowledge about, in a personal matter, but also through the faculty of consensus or shared experiences. So how might qualitative researchers use arts-based approaches to facilitate a deeper understanding of phenomena of interest? What is it about arts-based methods that enable these understandings? So in this recent article, we discussed three dominant avenues by which arts facilitate knowing about phenomena. The first relates to addressing shortcomings of traditional research approaches. So a major component of this debate has involved on the over-reliance of particular research approaches, such as interviewing. So arts-based strategies to data collection are touted as having potential to illuminate different aspects of human dimensions of health and illness, for instance, in ways not possible through non-arts-based approaches, but in a way that's also complementary. These approaches also facilitate understanding of participant groups for whom data collection approaches, such as individual or focus group interviews, may not be appropriate. So consider that in terms of development, socioeconomic status, and health status, for instance, marginalizations, experiences of pain, for instance, are perhaps more entrenched and difficult to articulate. The second way that arts can lend a deeper understanding of phenomena is by democratizing the research space. I think this is critical. So in our practices and in our day-to-day lives, we're continually exposed to dichotomies and arguably artificial divisions of the social sphere. So for instance, divisions such as moral and political suggest that political considerations can occur without moral consideration. And similarly in research, common divisions of qualitative and quantitative, art and science, fracture our thinking of how concepts in fact relate to one another. So these concepts don't exist in neat boxes that our categorical representations might suggest, but rather on continua or as overlapping constructs. So bringing art into research by way of art in this everyday really does challenge this tendency. So art is something that belongs to everyone, can equalize the space between researchers and participants, and facilitate co-creation approaches to knowledge production. Arts-based approaches can also challenge issues of representation by providing a voice to persons underrepresented through research. So, for instance, arts-based approaches can be used to critically inquire into stereotypes created and enforced through other means of representations. So this critical inquiry enables us to defamiliarize ourselves with common representations and stereotypes. So here's an example. So we're all really accustomed to particular portrayals, of culture, for instance, that at times we have difficulty distinguishing between authentic and constructed depictions. For instance, portrayals of geishas commonly reflect a Merocentric sort of perceptions or a romantic idealism, and at times even can reflect more of a misappropriated eroticism rather than a realistic representation of a deeply rooted cultural practice and custom. So examining these visual representations or using art to uncover these all too familiar associations can help us defamiliarize ourselves from entrenched and stereotypical perceptions to help us form a more authentic view of phenomena in question. So this is aesthetic work, and as Nielsen in 2004 wrote, this opens up this space for us that interrupts the ordinary and forces change. So it's a form of witness that may allow for transformation and transcendence, and this is precisely what we need to move beyond the contrived and superficial renderings of our complex social world. So visuals can be remarkably a useful tool for eliciting discussions. This is another way that arts can be have a high utility for use in particularly data collection. So visual data collection forms or elicitation can take many forms, but photo-based elicitation is quite a popular way. It is based on the straightforward premise of inserting photos into a qualitative research interview. But the usefulness here stems from innate differences in how humans respond to visual or text-based stimuli. So text and visuals are processed by distinct areas of the brain. So in fact, visual processing centers are older than verbal processing centers, and as such, integrating visual images into interviews taps into more of the brain's capacity. So visual elicitation in interviews not only evokes more information, but also different information than verbal interviews alone. So while photographs are the most commonly used visual and visual elicitation, other forms such as painting, drawing, sculpture, really any sort of visual form can also be of high utility. I think it's at a minimum very interesting to consider at least the work of French sculptor Auguste Rodin. So Rodin's sculptures really artfully capture these aspects of human experience that often we're trying to tap into in qualitative research. So, aspects of suffering and fundamentals of this human experience. So these can be used as a mechanism to critically examine what elements of experience are truly being reflected. Such work can be used to generate discussion regarding the essence of phenomena and provide insight into what individuals also regard as essential, or alternatively, as a prompt based on emotional and cognitive provocation enabled through exposure to artistic work. So how the understanding generated through art fits or doesn't fit with verbal data, for instance, obtained through qualitative inquiry, can provide rich sources of cross-comparison, or as some people will come to think of it, triangulation. This sort of brings us to the so what. So qualitative researchers have faced particular struggles over the years relating to the publication of findings and challenges about the so what of our work. So in response to this challenge, qualitative researchers are increasingly asking, how do we truthfully understand and represent what we intend to study? And how do we then communicate our qualitative findings in ways that are impactful and reflect the complexity and breadth of research? So in the words of American psychologist Kenneth Gergen, nobody reads journals, they're boring. Qualitative inquiry should be about what we can do with it. So wherever you sit on the spectrum of agreement to this statement, I think that the arts do have somewhat of a role in responding to this challenge. So Miasma Diary is an example of how qualitative research can be artistically transformed to overcome some perennial challenges related to sharing and communicating research findings. So as a component of my PhD work in nursing, I worked to create 4 prototypes of arts ebooks for parents using graphic illustration storytelling to share research, relate to parents' existing experiences in the context of childhood asthma, and fundamentally create books that would be more useful for them based on qualitative evidence and other forms of evidence as well. So creating the ebooks was a multi-stage and iterative process, including a couple of scoping reviews, an interpretive qualitative research study, and a highly collaborative interprofessional process of developing ebooks with creative writers, artists, digital media companies, and using a user-centered design process. So initial usability testing of the ebook showed promising results relating to knowledge gain and confidence related to day-to-day management of childhood asthma. But such renderings, of course, are not unproblematic. So when creating an arts-based tool such as this, that is quite, I guess, a vivid representation of reality, it raises questions whether endorsing a singularly correct interpretation of social phenomena is really art, and whether or not a piece of social research that aims in that direction is really arts-based. So these are important questions that I think we are prompted to ask of all the work that we do in this sphere. And they've really been forwarded by arts advocates and contributors Tom Barone and Elia Eisner. So they point to these unanswerable questions in the field and prompt us to question, really, what is the nature of data and representation? So when using the arts to engage participants and to communicate about research-associated evidence, it's useful to consider what's at work or the underlying mechanisms. Namely, how precise are we communicating about key messages? And how accurately do they need to be communicated? And how involved are participants in this process? Are participants more passively involved, as they would be while reading, let's say, a graphic novel about parenting transitions or the ebook that I had just shared with you? Or are they actively involved in a co-production of evidence that is in itself a transformational process, as you might see in more participatory theater? So using such a guiding framework as was developed by myself and colleagues Shannon Scott and Vera Kane is very helpful, I think, in considering how we might move beyond views of arts based on form alone to a deeper consideration of their mechanisms. Bringing us then to the concept of communicating through the arts. Even for those less interested in using the arts formally to communicate about research findings, there is utility in the arts to communicate complex meanings in engaging ways. Consider the following example about patient-centered care, which is increasingly seen as paramount to healthcare delivery. Yet it's really not fully realized in a great number of health settings. As is the case with numerous concepts, a number of definitions abound. So here's a definition presented by the Canadian Interprofessional Health Collaborative, and while it's very descriptive, the definition does not capture the reality of patient-centered care for many patients globally. So in a recent presentation on patient-centered care, I used the following visual example. So the benefit of using art to communicate the meaning of patient-centered care was for me that it conveyed both a complex message parsimoniously, but held also a luminal or subtle sort of hidden meaning, and that is, it simultaneously communicated what patient-centered care is, while suggesting that current practices aren't fully achieving their outcomes in health settings. So this may have been a bit more risky to communicate in a definition, but somehow visual communication can help soften delivery and simultaneously add a little bit of humor. So it's a highly useful approach. So considering then, we've discussed a bit about knowing about phenomena, knowing about context, knowing about ourselves by using arts, and now we can move towards knowing through the arts. And these are, again, we've been challenging these sort of binary distinctions between art and science. So again, I don't want to propose that these are mutually exclusive categories, but rather knowing about and knowing through art might exist on opposite ends of a continuum. So what does the notion of embodied experience mean when we're talking about knowing through the art? And how can this help us know about phenomena, stimulate reflexivity through research processes, and help us move beyond linear modes of communication and knowledge translation? How can we leverage emotions and link to people's understandings in order to enhance mutual understanding and shared meaning making? Art, or specifically art with aesthetic utility, has a distinct capacity to evoke an emotional response or resonate to create embodied experiences for both participants and viewers. So this augments processes of meaning making and in turn creates additional linkages to previous held knowledge and experiences. And these linkages promote understanding and information retrieval, and they also allow us to explore and inquire more deeply than is possible using just like text-based forms alone. So I'd like to share with you some examples of how the arts can be used in a more embodied capacity. So first is an example of visual inquiry into the luminal experiences of health and illness. So Living in Between was a visual exploration of the fluidity of health and a reflection on life events that hold the potential to threaten our concept of self. So namely, the self as healthy or the self as ill. So in this work, I explore the tension between ill and well self through use of the Day of the Dead imagery, a seemingly morbid symbolism that is in fact part of a vibrant celebration of individuals' lives passing. So I use this to explore how clear dichotomies between health and illness are in so many ways arbitrary, and more often our experiences of health and illness exist in degrees, residing in the spaces in between health and illness. But however, Western healthcare practices are often predicated on clear distinctions. Experiences and phenomena that oppose classification are sanctioned to a space in limbo, a gray space, or one that eludes diagnosis and measurement or exists in a space in between. Another example of using art making as a research medium, only this time, Aida and colleagues engaged with a professional artist who created visual renderings of care and caregiving based on direct interactions with research participants. So they worked with a professional artist who drew and painted over 100 portraits over a 2-year period while working with 46 participants. So a multidisciplinary analysis team then carried out the initial analysis of portraits and subject data. An analyst focused on the portraiture and its interpretation, noting correspondence with subject data. So here, art is treated as a medical research medium, where new and different understandings were developed only through the process of art making and then the subsequent process of reflecting upon the art making. Benjamin and colleagues provided an example of gaining knowledge through art by making music to access traumatic memories in men suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So here, participants were invited to experiment with musical instruments while talking spontaneously about their experiences. So while the intent of the study was largely therapeutic, findings illustrated the profound impact of the arts in moving past verbal and socially constructed responses to a more authentic understanding and representation of one's own experience. And this was a particularly moving example in the realm of music and music therapy. As one participant proclaimed, when we first came here, I told the group my experience, but it was in such an automatic and technical way without really feeling anything. But when the group played, it was totally different. I felt they could really empathize with me because they took part in my experience by playing my sounds. So the notion of playing my sounds, or sounds that this participant particularly identified with, really reflects that embodiment and that close association with the mechanism of art making and music making, which I believe is quite profound. Another example here around how qualitative researchers can gain understandings by using the arts is through using art as a meaningful reflexivity strategy. So reflexivity is a concept in qualitative research that we're all very familiar with and would know as well that notable rhetoric surrounds this concept, and its meaning and how we actually conduct reflexivity in practice is quite debatable. Partly because, as we had spoken briefly about before, is that it can be profoundly difficult to access entrenched assumptions and preconceptions that influence our research and practice. So arts-based strategies can aid in identifying these assumptions by, again, deconstructing our concepts, which, understood in the context of Dewey's aesthetics, is the intellectual work needed to reconcile our past experiences to align with new experiences and learning obtained through research. So Grove used arts-based inquiry as a complementary analysis technique. You can see this in the collage. So this was like a reflexivity strategy that she incorporated as data into her analysis. And so through the medium of collage, she explored 17 organizational cases in her study of organizational sustainability. So collage helped her explore and better understand the ways that multiple actors work together to administer a program based on trust and communication. So in this way, she was able to understand her position to the data that she had collected, examine current understandings of it, and generate an additional object of reflection to aid in this analysis. So I think that regardless if you think this collage has aesthetic appeal, her work is an important example of how we can engage with art making throughout interpretation to aid in reflexivity and representation. So because we're constantly challenged as qualitative researchers by our close positioning to the inquiry topics and to participants, similar arts-based approaches could help elevate our approach to reflexivity and generate a more truthful positioning in relation to our research. So we're reaching the end of our webinar today, and so I just wanted to summarize briefly. Arts and qualitative research are and have even greater potential to be mutually informative practices. So the breadth of application and points of intersection of the arts and qualitative research are really quite astounding. There's so many opportunities to integrate arts in various methodologies with a range of qualitative practices and traditions, and at a multitude of points of the research project, from problem identification, data collection, analysis, and dissemination. And I do have to point that there's a whole movement towards using the arts as a way to communicate about research findings. And often this takes the term of arts-based knowledge translation, which may be a familiar term to those of you in the health sciences, where knowledge translation has really developed out of a movement towards evidence-based practice, or finding ways to meaningfully communicate research findings to improve care and health services. But I believe that the concept is pertinent regardless of our area of practice, because we're all struggling to find ways to communicate meaningfully about our work in ways that are the most impactful. So when I reflect upon my own practice, and when I look at those fantastic scholars that I'm surrounded by doing really outstanding qualitative and mixed methods and quantitative research, you know, we publish this research and often it's sitting on the shelves, and we're lucky if it's read by other academics, and if it is, it's likely that that academic is writing a paper on a similar topic. But often the people who need to be hearing and learning about this research, you know, are the ones that maybe don't even have access to journal subscriptions, don't necessarily have the training behind to appraise that research. So, and also it's about the engagement with that work. So, you know, arts-based packaging of research information is quite a bit more engaging and can capture aspects of that humanistic element that I think innately a lot of qualitative researchers are drawn towards. So we really have an opportunity here to capitalize on natural synergies between arts and qualitative research to facilitate this trifecta, that understanding, communication, and representation, and as well to learn from art to improve our research practices, to enhance satisfaction with and impact of our work. So it's really an exciting time for this growing area of inquiry and representation. So thankfully, there's a number of fantastic resources available for us as we engage with arts and qualitative research. These cover a broad spectrum of practices and understandings. These are really just a few examples. So the Handbook of Arts and Qualitative Research by Knowles and Kroll is just a wealth of information. There's a number of journals specifically dedicated to the arts, some focusing on medical humanities, others specific to health, and others still on interdisciplinary practice. And there's an encouraging number of qualitative journals open to receiving theoretical and empirical articles on arts and qualitative research. So again, an exciting time for this growing field. So it's really been a privilege for me to be here today to discuss this topic. And, you know, regardless of your experiences and practices, regardless of where you are in the world, what time it is, day or night, in your location. I hope that you found this webinar useful, and I really thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Let's see if any one of you has questions for her. You may click on the hand icon next to your name in the GoToWebinar control panel, and in that way I will know that you would like to speak. I don't see yet any. Well, in fact, I do have a question here. Sandy, let me give you the microphone, and maybe you can say your question out loud. Your microphone is now open. Go ahead.
Hi, hi from New Zealand. I was just wondering.
Could you please talk a little bit closer to the microphone? The volume is a little low.
Okay, can you hear me now?
A little bit louder, if at all possible.
Okay, sure. I was just wondering if you have any specific examples or hints of where you've used some of these principles to communicate a summary of findings to participants.
Thanks for your question, Sandy. Absolutely. So a couple examples of that was, the PhD work around Miasma Diary was one of the most comprehensive examples of using arts about research to communicate qualitative research findings. So the challenge in the context of that PhD study was that, parents have been struggling to manage childhood asthma for 20 or 30 years, despite there being decades of very high quality research evidence around how to do this. So this was the problem that we really wanted to tackle. So the way that we engaged with that after conducting and identifying the problem through the literature reviews was to do the qualitative research study. So really identifying, what the challenges for parents, what information they felt they needed to know, how they'd like to receive this information, and then using that information to direct a story that was really a composite of all the different parents that I interviewed throughout that qualitative study. Then working again with the artists to develop visuals that represented some aspects of most of the parents in the sample, which, as you can imagine, would be very challenging. And then feeding that back to these participants. And you would be interested to know that despite having such a diverse sample, that most parents really saw themselves in both the visuals and in the narrative, which suggests that, that approach, which is, creating the composite arts-based approach to communicate about research based on qualitative data, was quite effective. We're currently engaged in a number of projects, partly as at the University of Alberta, and also as part of my fellowship at the University of Adelaide, to create representations of these research findings and also use art as inquiry throughout our work with both the aging population within the context of frailty, as well as doing some work around heart disease. So it will be very interesting to see how that work also develops.
Thank you, Mandy. I will open the microphone for Christine. Go ahead, Christine. You have a question, it seems.
Sound is okay? Oh, hi. Hope the sound is okay.
Sounds good.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Go ahead.
I don't know why I'm getting echo, but thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. I had a funny question for you, Mandy. Do you think that if people are artists, that using this type of work with them might not work so well? Let me give you a thought question. Perspective. Sorry, it's hard to think when you have echo. I do research.
Maybe,
and
Mandy, would you try to close? Well, I will close your microphone, Mandy, and let's see if that improves it. It's closed now.
Okay.
I will close mine as well, and go ahead now.
Oh, yeah, that's better. So I do research on musicians' health, and my minor efforts at getting musicians to think about their wellness from a music perspective really fell a bit flat. And one of the reasons I think that might be is because musicians don't respond to music the same way that other people do. I mean, we're really quite right-brained about it, so it becomes much more analytical. So I wonder if it has to be an art form that one is not familiar with in order to really work in terms of representing something that's relatively abstract. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Your microphone is open now, Mandy. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I have to say, I haven't engaged in creating and working with other artists in that same sort of capacity that you're thinking about. But we've definitely encountered challenges in terms of sort of tailoring particular art forms for use with various populations. And my experience has almost been on the opposite end of that spectrum. So, um, bringing, let's say, visual arts, for instance, to a group of individuals who consider themselves to be non-artists, and how that lack of perceived capacity to engage with the work is a complete barrier for us to moving into that sort of authentic engagement space. So, in the specific context that you're speaking about, I'd be curious to know if it has anything to do with the type of music and it's sort of um, the type of music that you're working with, and whether that's quite similar to the practice and type of music that these particular participants are working with, and whether that would make any sort of difference in your sort of experience. Currently, I'm having a very positive experience. I'm in the early engagement of working with another artist who will be doing some work for our frailty work. And again, it's been a very positive experience. That was based on, we engaged him based on an understanding of his artistic process and his experience in working with other research teams of that. So there was a real alignment there. But yeah, it's a very interesting consideration, and you should definitely consider writing a paper on that.
Yes, hi. Okay. So thank you very much, Mandy, for the answer. Christine, any follow-up from that?
Oh, do you still have me on? No, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? No, I probably should think about writing it. But interestingly, I didn't actually have them play music or listen to music or anything. All I did, this was just such a small attempt at it, was ask them if there was music that represented their experience. And most of them they just had virtually no response. They couldn't even get into the right headspace for that. And I found myself questioning why that might be afterwards. So yeah, it's a really good point. I probably should follow that up and find out what that's all about.
And you know what, Christine, I would, just hearing and not knowing much about your study, but uh, having worked with musicians in other sort of capacities, how about using some sort of visual technique in that regard? So almost playing certain types of music and having them, draw some sort of their response to that work. And then you'd
Yeah,
be working with some quite interesting sort of visual strategies for analysis. So you might
yeah,
have more luck getting at those responses through non-verbal communications, because I think
yeah.
by nature, musicians and artists, we trend towards non-verbal communication, and so it wouldn't actually be too surprising, I suppose, in that respect, that they'd have some difficulty communicating verbally about their responses there.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So now there is something that Duncan sent. He sent a link. So let me give you the microphone, Duncan, so that you can explain what that is about. Okay? The microphone is open, Duncan. Go ahead. Are you there? Yes. Well, so he sent a link to Concordia University news, and it says the art of the heart transplant hybrid bodies. So I don't know if you can see that link, Mandy.
You know what? I can't see that link, but I'm familiar with that work.
Okay,
So yeah, that's very pertinent to our ongoing work, and I thank Duncan for highlighting it. It's very interesting work.
I'm gonna send this to everybody. Okay, so you will all have that. Um,
Yeah.
let me see. Let me see. Anybody else? Let me see. Min is asking if the session is being recorded, and the answer is yes. And you will have access to that on the IQM website. And I sent the link already to all of you, so you will find it there, and it will probably be there by, if not Friday, tomorrow, by Monday. Anybody else would like to ask a question? I don't see anybody's hand up. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Okay, here it is. Paula, I'll give you the microphone. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, Mandy. I'm really interested in your topic. It's fascinating, and I've done a little bit of arts-based inquiry with nursing students, and really not doing a study as such, but just having them use their creative, I guess, side of their brain to produce something artsy to represent, say, a transition, because I teach maternal child, and with pregnancy there's a lot of transitions that occur, and I found it just amazing what the students were able to produce based on the knowledge that they were given in the course, and especially when they consider themselves non-creative. And it's amazing what they produce, and then when you hear their descriptions of what it represented, it's fascinating. So there's a study on right now that the School of Nursing is doing and looking at caring in first-year nursing students and fourth-year nursing students. And again, they're doing some arts-based inquiry where they're giving the students some paint and a canvas, a blank canvas, and just asking them to paint what caring means to them. So I'm just wondering, and I joined the session a bit late, but do you have any, I know you had some articles that you put up, but any sort of resources that can help with the analysis?
Mandy, we only have 3 minutes, and after you answer this question, I would like to give the microphone to Diana Lara, because she asked a question earlier and I missed her. So go ahead, please.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Paula. So just a couple of sort of comments. First is that I just commend you because, you know, the student's capacity to express, even though they didn't associate with being an artist, I think speaks to, you know, your capacity to create a safe space for that sort of production. So I think that's great. And yes, I would have a few resources that would help you, but with a disclaimer that, you know, this area, particularly in the pedagogical space and how we might analyze that and is very new. But send me an email, and I'm on vacation this week coming up, but we can sort of touch base about that, and hopefully there'll be something of use for you, okay?
Thank you, Mandy. Diana, would you like to say your question out loud? Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, my name is Deanna Lara, and I'm also a contemporary dancer and choreographer and a public health researcher. And I want to collect data about identity and the experience of migration with migrants from Central America in California using movement. And I am still figuring out how I can collect and analyze the data. And I am collaborating with also a choreographer from Guatemala, and she will be doing the same in Guatemala. And we are hoping to create a collective choreography with the movements that are provided by all the migrants that participate in the workshop. So that would be the way that we will translate our exploration. But I am looking for tools to express what we are finding through words, and I was wondering what ideas you have about it.
Sorry, your question is tools that can help express what you're finding through words?
Yeah, more analyzing and the data that we're through movement.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, you know, I can honestly say I'm not sure how much there is specific to what the precise area that you're speaking about, which is co-creating dance performances. What I'm understanding is utilizing movements from participants and then incorporating that into your actually contemporary dance choreography. There is really interesting literature around the interdisciplinary production sort of sphere, collaborative dance as a whole. But what I've been finding more and more as I get more entrenched in this whole area of arts and arts-based inquiry, and particularly collaborative and co-creating knowledge, is that, you know, we are very much at the beginning of a movement. So often you're pulling from disparate sort of resources and fundamentally creating a methodology that's very specific to your aim. So, again, if you send me an email more specifically with what you're looking for, I can sort of tap my brain for a few resources, but my sense is that you would be pulling quite broadly from a variety of different spheres. Again, we're sort of creating our frameworks as we go along here. So,
thank you, Mandy, very much for your answer as well as for your presentation today. I would like to ask Yvette from IIQM to say a few words before we end.
Thanks, Ricardo, and thank you, Mandy, for a great presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for attending the Masterclass webinar series this year. This is our last one for 2016, but we will be starting the series again in January 2017. So keep an eye on the IIQM website, UAlberta, or iiqm.ualberta.ca, and the schedule should hopefully be posted within the next few weeks.
Thank you very much, Yvette.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Mandy. Any last words, Mandy? Any final words before we close?
Yeah, I really just appreciate the opportunity. It's a very exciting topic, and I appreciate as well the great questions that was presented today. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much, Mandy. Thank you, all of you, for joining. And please keep on coming. This webinar series is now in its 4th year, and we depend on your participation. So let's contribute by coming to our sessions, and in that way we will be able to keep on going for another number of years. So thank you, all of you, for coming today. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.